Between the summer of 1979 and the spring of 1981, something dark stalked the streets of Atlanta. One by one, black children began to vanish, some as young as 7 years old. What started as isolated incidents quickly grew into a wave of disappearances that would rattle A-Town to its core. Within months, bodies were being found in wooded areas, riverbanks, and vacant lots, often unclothed, strangled, and cruelly discarded. By the time it ended, at least 29 young lives had been lost. Children, teenagers, and young adults, all taken too soon under circumstances that remain murky even today. The terror that gripped Atlanta during those years wasn't just about violence. It was about what that violence revealed, that some lives were more protected than others, and some cries for help took far too long to be answered. From the start, the investigation was pure chaos. The victims came from poor and working-class black neighborhoods, places already struggling with institutional neglect and mistrust of the police. Many of the early person reports were brushed aside as runaways. It wasn't until the numbers grew and the bodies mounted that authorities began to consider the horrifying possibility that a serial killer was at large. But even then, the investigation was marred by confusion, pressure, and politics. Local police, the FBI, and city officials all scrambled to contain the crisis while balancing public fear and national attention. Volunteers patrolled their own streets, community leaders demanded answers, parents kept their children home from school and off the streets, and no one was safe. Clues surfaced, but few made sense. Some victims were last seen getting into cars with strangers. Others vanished without a trace. Items like phone numbers, animal hairs, and articles of clothing offered fragments of a puzzle that never seemed to fully fit together. And then there were the sightings. Boys being approached at MARTA stations, strange men lurking near community centers, names whispered and dismissed, tips called in too late. Eventually, a suspect emerged, but whether that person was responsible for all or even most of the murders has remained a matter of debate ever since. While officials declared the case solved, many families were left with more questions than answers. Some believe the true killer was never caught, others think there may have been more than one, and others still are haunted by the idea that the murders were never truly meant to be solved at all. Atlanta turned into a hunting ground for children, and to determine who was so sick in the head to attack innocent children, why it was overlooked and went on for so long, we have to go behind the headlines. Edward Smith, or better known as Teddy, is one of the many victims in the case of Atlanta's missing and murdered. Teddy was just a mere 14 years old and unfortunately wouldn't make it to see 15. On July 21, 1979, he seemingly up and vanished. He had been seen around 12:30 a.m. with his girlfriend exiting the Greenbrier skating rink. Only 4 days after the disappearance of Smith, another young boy, Alfred Evans, also vanished. Smith and Evans weren't strangers to each other. There were claims that the night of Smith's disappearance, after he departed the skating rink, he and Evans were at a pot party together. Now, a pot party wasn't a KitchenAid swap party. It was said to have been a kickback of sorts that lots of teens in Atlanta attended. It was a space for teens to smoke the devil's lettuce, listen to music, and hang out. Alfred Evans, who sometimes went by Q, had a lot of interests. He loved to play basketball and box at Warren Memorial Boys Club. He was also a big fan of wrestling. But a 13-year-old boy is no match for a grown man, no matter how hard he fights. A man named Randy Joe Heath was one of the last people to see Evans. Heath claimed that he had given Evans a ride to the bus stop and chatted with Evans. He had been going to see a show at the Coronet Theater. When Evans never returned home from the theater, the community was sent into a panic. Edward Smith had been missing too, and in the close-knit black community of Atlanta, everyone could tell something wasn't quite right. Randy Joe, Heath's mother, spearheaded the search for the boys and had asked a man named Wayne Williams to distribute flyers for the boys around the Thomasville Heights area. Williams didn't do so, but he did hire another man to distribute the flyers. Nearly 7 days after Edward Smith went missing and 3 after Alfred Evans, an old woman had been wandering around the 1700 block of Atlanta near South River looking for cans to recycle for cash. The area was heavily wooded, but she saw something the summer heat and tree limbs wouldn't dare to cover up. She found the body of Edward Smith, and likely the body of Alfred Evans. Smith's body was identified immediately. He had been wearing a black jersey with red lettering, and there was a gunshot wound in his upper back, But the gunshots didn't end his life. What ended his life were the bare hands of an insufferable man who had strangled him maniacally. It wasn't easy to identify Evans. His body had suffered more water damage than Smith's. It took over a year to confirm that the little boy was Alfred. He had been murdered in the exact same way as Smith, and he was found dressed in all black, in clothes that didn't belong to him. Milton Harvey was a 14-year-old who loved endlessly, but he would also fall victim to the Atlanta child murderer. On September 4th, 1979, around 10:30 a.m., Milton was seen at Citizens Southern Bank on a yellow bike. The bank was about 3 miles from his family's home, and he was doing his mom a solid by dropping off a check for $100 to pay her credit card bill. If it were any other regular day, Milton would have been at Harper High School, but he had stayed home that day because his mom bought the wrong shoes. She planned on buying the correct shoes that evening, but she wouldn't need to, as something much more traumatic than incorrect shoes was waiting for Milton. After dropping the check at the bank, Milton wouldn't be seen again, but someone did report seeing his yellow bike being pushed by two strange boys about an hour and a half after Milton would have been at the bank. About a week later, that same yellow bike was found up against a pine tree near the Charlie Brown Airport, and Milton was still nowhere to be found. In mid-November 1979, over 2 months after he disappeared, Milton's skeletal remains were found at a dump in the south side of Atlanta by a man who had been picking up cans, likely intending to turn them in for some change. The remains were quickly identified as Milton, ripping the hearts of his family out, and he had been missing the clothing he left in that day. His cause of death was never able to be determined, and his case remains unsolved to this day. Sundays are meant for rest, recovery, and spending time with your loved ones, but for Yusuf Bell, Sunday, October 21st, 1979, was anything but peaceful. He was only 9 years old and was the sweetest little boy. He took to the grocery store for his neighbor who needed a couple of things, and the store was only a few blocks away, and Yusuf loved to help others in any way he could. His hope in the world had not yet been robbed. Witnesses claimed that they last saw him without shoes or a shirt, getting into a blue car between a fenced-in playground and an apartment building. He would never be seen again after this. An onlooker who knew the family said the driver resembled Yusuf's father, but Yusuf's mother quickly rebuked this, as she was very familiar with this particular onlooker and deemed her untrustworthy due to her destructive drinking habits. Yusuf's father, John Bell, was subsequently questioned due to allegedly being sided with his son before he went missing. He agreed to a polygraph and assured everyone that Yusuf was okay. He failed the polygraph. On November 8, 1979, a janitor was cleaning out the then empty E.P. Johnson Elementary School. He was looking for a place to relieve himself and settled on the crawl space. But when he went into the crawl space, he found something much more horrifying than cockroaches and cobwebs. Little Yusuf Bell was found wearing only cut-off shorts. He had 2 injuries to his skull where he had been struck, but his cause of death was determined to be strangulation. A pattern seemingly forms. The killing seemed to have ceased after Yusuf Bell was taken, and the residents of Atlanta felt a sort of relief, but the relief was temporary. One of the most violent victims there has been thus far was a 12-year-old girl named Angel Lanier. On March 4th, 1980, Angel, Everbright, dressed herself in a cute denim outfit and went over to one of her friend's houses to watch Sanford & Sons around 4 p.m. A few hours went by and Angel left her friend's house around 7 p.m. Sadly, she would never make it home that night. And police searched the area where Angel was last seen, and they came across a very odd man. The man had been loitering in the area and wore an electrical cord as a belt. The police thought him to be a person of interest because he had been arrested previously for grabbing a child. The police kept on this lead as they continued to search for Angel, and 6 days after her disappearance, she was found on March 10, 1980. Angel's body was discovered by investigators in a heavily wooded area only 3 blocks from her home. She was found in that cute denim outfit, but someone had stuffed a pair of white panties in her mouth and bound her hands with an electrical cord. Her official cause of death was asphyxiation by ligature strangulation. However, the person of interest, the one who wore an electrical cord as a belt, was never arrested, and Angel's case remains unsolved to this day. But there are some strong beliefs about who made Angel an angel. Jeffrey Mathis didn't have an easy go at life, and it seemingly wouldn't get any easier. The 11-year-old boy lived in West Atlanta with his mom and siblings. Jeffrey's grandfather, Pappy, had been murdered in 1974 at the cemetery burial office where he worked. Little did Jeffrey know he would fall victim to the hands of someone else only 6 years after his grandfather. He worked hard carrying groceries for people at the local Kroger and was always on the go. He was last seen on March 11, 1980, just a day after Angel was found, leaving his home to go to the Star Service station, a gas station, to pick up a loaf of bread and cigarettes. A barber said Jeffrey had knocked on the window of his shop. Another witness, months after his disappearance, claimed he saw Jeffrey get into a blue car with 2 black men near Anderson's Produce. Another witness named Willie Turner claimed that he had seen Jeffrey in a blue car nearly 2 weeks after he went missing. Soon after Turner's alleged sighting of Jeffrey, he was held at gunpoint by the driver of the blue car behind an old building. Fortunately, he survived, but it makes you wonder, what did he really see? Almost a year after Jeffrey went missing in March of 1980, he was found by FBI agents with search dogs who had been tracking his scent. He was said to have been found in a briar-covered patch of woodlands. However, because of the amount of time it took to find Jeffrey, there wasn't a lot of forensic evidence to prove that the remains they found were truly his, but many believe it's him. At this point, Atlanta parents and the black community are outraged at the killings of these children. They're worried, horrified, and feeling unsafe, and there has seemingly been no clue to who is harming these innocent children. There's an alleged 100 victims, mostly children, but some adults, who died at the hands of one monstrous man, and as of March 1980, this monster is still on the loose, and his reign of terror isn't anywhere near done. Eric Middlebrooks, 14, was the foster son of Robert and Evelyn Miller, and was active in his community. He was loved unconditionally, and often liked to hang out at the neighborhood boys club and swim. One day on May 18, 1980, he was seen at home talking hushedly on the landline. After the call ended, he hurried out of the house and took his bike and sped away. What's intriguing is that he left home with a hammer in tow. Why he needed to rush away and take a hammer is unbeknownst to us all, as he would likely never get to where he was going. The next day, Eric was discovered without breath in his lungs, next to his bicycle behind a bar called Hope You Like It. His pockets had been turned inside out as if he had been shaken down, and his upper body was plagued with stab wounds. However, the brutal incisions aren't what made him lose his life. Once the autopsy had been performed, the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. However, there was a lot of uncertainty about who may have ended Eric's life. He had previously testified against 3 other boys in court a few weeks earlier, and it speculated that they had taken his life in retaliation. But there was another oddity at the scene. There was a small tuft of strange fiber lodged in Eric's shoe. After being analyzed, this fiber would help bring the killer to justice, but the killings wouldn't stop anytime soon. In June of 1980, 12-year-old Christopher Richardson was leaving Crystal's Hamburgers after having lunch and was headed towards the Midway Recreation Center to go for a swim. He didn't make it to the rec center, and he wouldn't be seen again until January 1981. But in January, his body remained, but his spirit had long been gone. He was allegedly found by a homeowner's dog. The man said his dog had been nosing in something that smelled rancid, and so he investigated and found something he'd never be able to unsee. Christopher's body and the body of another victim, whom we'll cover later, was found missing all of his clothing, and it's well known that the Atlanta Police Department severely mishandled this crime scene, which robbed the family of closure of knowing if the body was for sure Christopher Richardson. Investigators abandoned body parts, bones, and teeth at the scene, leaving behind crucial forensic evidence. However, they did tag some other things that were located near the body, including shotgun shells, a Penthouse magazine, a gallery magazine, a cigarette butt, and a magnetic recording tape. It's unclear if anything was run for DNA, but the shotgun shells most certainly were, and the prints matched someone in the system. But the police declined to pursue or reveal who this person was because they simply didn't think they were a strong suspect. If the proper authorities had handled the preservation of the scene properly, there is the possibility that a lot fewer children would have lost their lives. Once again, the body that was discovered was highly believed to be Christopher Richardson but never confirmed, and the evidence proves to be more doubtful as the teeth found at the scene were later tested and found not to belong to Christopher. It seems as though the killer got messy with this murder, something he had yet to do. He left evidence, crucial evidence, and because the case was mishandled, he wouldn't be brought to justice yet. LaTanya Wilson was the second and final girl to fall victim to the Atlanta child murderer. She wasn't the last victim, simply the last confirmed female. The sheer number of victims in this case makes even the strongest stomach twist and turn with disgust for the human or humans who thought they had the power to take lives. LaTanya had only known the world for 7 years and was abducted from her bed by 2 men in Dixie Hills. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, and she shared a room with her brothers, meaning the intruders scaled the complex and broke into a window without waking anyone, and then took LaTanya on June 22, 1980. The circumstances don't really add up though. It's recorded that LaTanya's brother's bed was pushed up against the window that the intruders allegedly came through, meaning they would have had to crawl over him to get to LaTanya. Doing this once would be difficult enough, but a neighbor, Gladys Durden, claimed she saw the men go in through the window 4 separate times. What they did the entire time they were in the apartment is unknown, and how no one woke up is baffling. But their exit was far less complicated. Instead of scaling back down the complex, they simply left through the back door, down the fire escape, leaving the door ajar. Durden claims she also saw the intruder in the parking lot talking to another man while holding LaTanya in his arms. It makes you wonder, was LaTanya asleep, or was she stunned? Or simply not afraid because perhaps she knew and trusted her captor? Nathaniel Cater, another victim that we will discuss later, was known to have once lived above the Wilson family, and Durden claims that he was one of the men who had broken into LaTanya's home. Another neighbor in the complex, Amp Willie, said that earlier in the day, he saw an old van and 2 strange men hanging around near the back door of the Wilsons' apartment. Willie then returned to his apartment, and through their shared wall, he heard a commotion, saying it sounded like someone was getting a whooping, and he had heard Ella Wilson, LaTanya's mom, screaming, "Stop!" After about an hour, Willie left his apartment and found Ella sitting on her porch, seemingly distraught. About 4 months after LaTanya was robbed of her family, her body was found in a fenced-in area of the United Youth Adult Conference of Atlanta. Because of the amount of time that had passed, her little body had been given back to the soil, and all that was left was bone. Her cause of death was never able to be determined, and her case is still unsolved almost 50 years later. 10-year-old Aaron Weish was last seen on June 23, 1980, at Tanner's grocery store, a place he frequently visited as he lived very close by, and likely helped people carrying their groceries to their cars. He was reported to have gotten into a blue and white Chevrolet with 2 black men. The car matched the description of the car that Jeffrey Mathis had been seen getting into the previous March. The same witness who reported seeing Aaron get into the car said he had seen Aaron being led away from the storefront by a black man who was around 30 years old with a mustache and goatee. The witness said he had greeted Aaron to make sure he was safe, and Aaron acknowledged the man and was seemingly fine. He went on as if nothing was amiss. Aaron then got into the shotgun seat of the car, and the older man got into the driver's seat, but they didn't drive away immediately. The witness watched them for a few moments, and he said it looked like the man in the driver's seat was doing something with his hands in his lap. Later that same day, another witness saw Aaron by himself in Moreland Avenue Shopping Center, and that was the last reported sighting of Aaron Weish alive. The very next day, Aaron's body was found under a bridge that housed train tracks. The killer seems to have gone back to his original MO of taking the air out of children's lungs because Aaron's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation coupled with a broken neck. The broken neck was determined to likely be from falling or being pushed off the overhead bridge. The horrors that little boy saw and endured will never be forgotten. But his killer would eventually be brought to justice once the police decided to start taking the cases of these children seriously. 10 children. 10 children is how many we've covered so far, and there are still many more. Atlanta's prevalent black community was outraged and felt as though the police department was failing them. The community publicly revolted and questioned, how many of our children have to die before something is done? We'd like to believe the police did everything in their power, but remembering America's past must come into play here. Atlanta was a mecca of progression. So many people of color flocked here in the late 1900s. It was a place of peace, community, and acceptance, until it wasn't. It sounds far-fetched, it's the 80s after all, but discrimination continues to this day. We've come a long way as a nation, but we have a long way to go. So the police felt attacked, and black people in Atlanta were under attack. There would be no winners in this case, and I don't want you to think there will be, because the case of Atlanta's missing and murdered children is wildly upsetting. Anthony Carter was only 9 years old when he disappeared from his yard while playing hide and seek with his cousins on July 6, 1980. For such a small age, he was a hard worker, constantly picking up odd jobs around the West End Mall for a little spare change. But the search for Anthony didn't last long. It had only been a day since he went missing, and hopes were high that he'd be brought home alive and well to his family. Sadly, he was found stabbed to death near a dumpster. A group of workers found him only 50 yards from their work site. Only 2 weeks had passed since the last tragic death of a child. Whoever was doing this was hungry and seemingly couldn't get enough. But with the lack of resources and the police department not taking the situation nearly as seriously as they should, the killing continued. Earl Terrell, a last name that we will hear once again later on, was sitting on the curb of South Bend Park pool after he had been kicked out by one of the lifeguards. He was only 10 and likely was cutting up when he shouldn't have, as any 10-year-old would. Other kids said they'd seen him knocking on the door of one of his friends' houses, and another said he was buying popsicles from a street corner to beat the late July heat. He was also allegedly spotted crying near the block where he brought the popsicles. Earl wouldn't be seen again, but which of these sightings was the truth? Or were they all? The next day, July 31st, 1980, a middle-aged sounding man with a strong southern accent had called the Terrell home and stated that he had Earl and that he was in Alabama, and he would bring him back if they gave him $200 by Friday. I'm sure the family obliged, though it's not recorded, but the caller never called back, and so there was no way to get in contact with the man who had allegedly been holding Earl captive. In January 1981, Earl was found alongside the body of the aforementioned Christopher Richardson, and the scene was poorly preserved once again. It's not 100% confirmed that the boy was Earl, as it had been 6 months since his disappearance, but it's likely. Clifford Jones was just 12 years old. Originally from Chattanooga, he had come to Atlanta to live with his maternal grandmother, Dorothy Williams. He and his brother Dwayne had taken to collecting aluminum cans to earn a little money, and during one of these outings, the two boys had stumbled upon the body of a murdered man, something no child should ever have to witness. This incident is completely unrelated to what happened to dear Clifford, but it shows that this boy had already seen enough and didn't deserve what was to come. On August 20th, 1980, Clifford was last seen standing on a street corner with his brother, trying to sell cans. The next day, his body was found beside a dumpster outside the Hollywood Plaza laundromat. He had bruises and cuts on his mouth, was missing his underwear, and was wearing strange shorts and shoes. His cause of death was asphyxiation, but it's what witnesses claim they saw that night that's perhaps the most disturbing. 3 young people at the laundromat alleged they saw the manager, James Edward Brooks, along with another man named Calvin Beat, strangle and drag Clifford's body toward the trash through a window. One of them, a boy named Freddie, told police Brooks had fondled and anally raped Clifford before strangling him with a yellow rope. Freddie also said Brooks had washed the body with soap and a rag, then redressed him. The police reportedly dismissed Freddie, calling him retarded. 2 other witnesses saw a man in a hooded robe leave Brooks's home carrying something large wrapped in plastic, which he placed by the dumpster before making an anonymous phone call, the very one that led police to the scene. A 4th witness said Brooks had taken Clifford and another man back to his house. That same man claimed to have seen the hooded robe inside Brooks's residence and said he'd actually spent the night there. He and Brooks had met at the Silver Dollar Saloon, a spot where men frequently met to engage in illicit sexual activities. Despite all of this, Brooks was never convicted for Clifford's death. They believe there was someone else involved. He was later sentenced in a separate case for aggravated assault with intent to rape, but was eventually released and then passed of AIDS not long thereafter. There's a lot of evidence that proves that this murder could have been an isolated event apart from the other children and their convicted murder, but there's no way to really know the truth. Darren Glass was a mere 11 years old when he vanished without a trace on Sunday, September 14th, 1980. His neighbors and foster mom, Fannie Mae, described him as kind-hearted, and he often played in the yard of Drina Andrew with the other neighborhood kids. That afternoon, Darren had gone to an Atlanta Braves game with his church group, something many of Atlanta's kids did in the late summer when the heat started to fade and baseball gave the city something to rally around. At about 5:30 p.m., witnesses saw him getting off the church bus, but something unthinkable happened between when he got off the bus and began to walk home. Later that night, Fannie Mae got a call she would never forget. The voice on the line claimed to be Darren, calling in some sort of emergency, but before she could get any details, the line abruptly went dead, leaving a cavernous hole in the stomach of Fannie Mae. And that was it. Weeks passed, then months, and Darren's foster brother, Eric Carr, started claiming that not only had he been in contact with Darren, but that he actually knew where he was. He said the phone calls had continued as late as November, 2 whole months after Darren was last seen, but no evidence ever backed up Eric's claims. And unlike the other children who disappeared around the same time, Darren's body was never recovered. His case remains open, and out of the 30 children connected to the Atlanta child murders, Darren Glass is the only one whose remains haven't been recovered. And that's if you consider Christopher Richardson and Earl Terrell to have been found. Charles Stevens was only 10 years old when he disappeared on Thursday, October 9th, 1980, from his home in Pryor Circle in Atlanta. A 6th grader at Parkson Elementary, Charles was known for his love of drawing and spent a lot of his time sketching or playing outside. But like many kids growing up in underserved neighborhoods, his life wasn't without complications. He had been accused of stealing and even dealing drugs. He was also known to hang around the Zaire department store and the Stewart Lakewood shopping center, the same place Luby Jeter, who we'll discuss later, was last seen, and sometimes spent time with an older man who drove a red Ford LTD. On the day he went missing, Charles had reportedly been watching TV and drawing at home. He told his family he might go visit a friend or cousin in Carver Homes. A neighbor, Jerome Clark, later said he saw Charles skateboarding near a dumpster in front of his house and noticed a strange man standing between 2 buildings nearby. Jerome called out to the man, but he wouldn't respond. By the next day, Charles's body was found near the entrance to the Longview trailer park, lying on a grassy hill. He was partially clothed, wearing one of his sister's shoes, and missing his t-shirt entirely. There were hard rub marks on his nose and mouth, but the exact cause of death was listed as undetermined asphyxiation. Forensics uncovered troubling details: dog hairs and 2 white head hairs on his body, and 2 pubic hairs on his underwear, found about 950 feet away, none of which matched Charles's. Another family was left devastated without answers. He was only 9, the kind of kid who found joy in simple things, like swimming at the Thompsonville Heights Recreation Center or visiting an older woman named Miss Williams who had taken a liking to him. Aaron Jackson went to Dobbs Elementary and had friends like Aaron Weish and Patrick Rogers, names you'll become familiar with, boys who, like him, were just trying to grow up in a city that was becoming more dangerous by the day. On November 1st, 1980, he had been at the Moreland Avenue Shopping Center, a place full of life, and then he was gone in an instant. The next day, his body was discovered off Forest Park Road, and he had been missing his socks. The medical examiner ruled his cause of death as asphyxiation by suffocation, and that one detail feels unbearable to think about how terrified that little child must have been. Just a year later, an attorney was found murdered in nearly the same spot, adding another strange layer to an already devastating story. Aaron should have had more time, more days spent swimming, more afternoons hanging out with friends, but like too many other children and eventually adults, his life was stolen and his memory now lingers in light. Aaron Jackson is the last known child under 12 to have had his life ripped away from him. Our killer seems to think he can take on older boys, and he does for a while, but I promise his reign of terror will come to an end. This isn't a happy story, and they usually aren't on Behind the Headlines, but justice is sweet with this one. He had dreams, the kind that lived in notebooks filled with lyrics. 16-year-old Patrick Rogers, who his friends called Patman, spent his free time writing music with his best friend Joe Harper. He was a student at Grady High, known for carrying groceries at the Moreland Avenue Shopping Center, and for being connected with a long thread of boys who would all vanish and lose their lives under eerily similar circumstances. He knew Aaron Weish and Aaron Jackson, and his mother later said he was also friends with Darren Glass, Luby Jeter, and Curtis Walker. On November 10th, 1980, Patrick was last seen standing at a bus stop with his kid brother, Isaac. That would be the last time anyone saw him alive. Just 2 days later, while his family was still praying and pleading for his safe return, a burglary warrant was issued for Patrick, another moment where the system seemed more interested in documenting his mistakes than finding him. Nearly a month later, on December 7th, his body was found caught on rafter cables under the Paces Ferry Road Bridge on the Cobb County side of the Chattahoochee River. He suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Whatever music he'd hoped to write, whatever future he might have carved for himself, was left behind in a city that never gave him the chance. And what's really rough is that he was just trying to help his family, selling car deodorizers outside the Big Star food store at Stewart Lake Shopping Center, trying to make a few dollars the honest way. 14-year-old Luby Jeter had taken on a lot for his age. He juggled high school at J.C. Murphy, worked at National Pride Car Wash, and lent a spare hand at Ann's Snack Shop. That Saturday, January 3rd, 1981, his brother dropped him off at work, and it should have been a normal day, but it wasn't. Witnesses later said Luby got into 3 different cars, a red pickup, a white one, and finally a black and white Cutlass. Whether he truly got in all 3 of these cars on separate occasions or simply someone has the story very twisted is unknown. One woman claimed she saw him get into a car with a man outside Sears. That man, she would later testify, was a man called Wayne Williams. Luby never came home, and as fear began to spread through the hearts of his friends and family, the landline started to ring. A man calling himself the Killer rang the Jeter home, his voice traced back to payphones on Stewart Avenue. He didn't give details, but the implication was clear. Something awful had happened to little Luby, Over a month later, on February 5th, a dog led its owner to a wooded stretch in southeast Atlanta. There, in a creek, they found Luby's body, stripped of everything but his white undershorts. His other clothes were scattered, his jeans and belt stuffed haphazardly in a brown bag 3 feet deep into the water. His shirt and shoes found 300 yards away. His body took some time to identify. He had been in the woods for quite some time, and in the age-old argument of man versus nature, nature always wins. Wildlife had utterly mutilated his small frame. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as manual strangulation, meaning someone wrapped their cold hands around his neck and watched the life be sucked out of him. His death became one more thread in the growing web of fear that was gripping Atlanta, and one more name on a list no child ever deserved to be on. 15-year-old Terry Pugh was hanging around his neighborhood on Hollywood Road when he asked his friend Clinton to come shoot hoops. But it was raining, so Clinton didn't want to. Undeterred, Terry played alone. He was the kind of kid who didn't let a little weather stop him. Later that afternoon, January 20th, 1981, Terry's brother Tony saw him getting on a bus. It would be the last time anyone in his family saw him alive. That night, Terry was spotted at a Crystal's fast food restaurant on Memorial Drive, where he spent the night. Why he spent the night there is unknown. Whether this was something he did relatively frequently and was normal is a strange thought. The very next morning, he was seen cashing in glass bottles at a nearby store, trading them for spare change so he could buy something to eat. Then, he vanished. A disturbing call had come into the police 2 weeks earlier. On January 8th, a man claimed a boy's body could be found off Sigma Road in Rockdale County. Officers searched and found nothing and moved on, but the caller rang back again, this time claiming he had left another body in the same location. On January 23rd, a passerby walking near the wooded stretch discovered the body of a young boy. It was Terry. He had been left like a garbage bag in a place police had already been warned about, exemplifying how police may have made a colossal error throughout this whole slew of tragic deaths. Years later, more skeletal remains were found in the same area. It's unconfirmed, but these remains could be speculated to be another child who was the victim of the Atlanta child murders. Terry was quickly identified by surgical scars on his right knee. His body bore blue and purple bruises on his head, abrasions on his elbow, and dog hairs strangely clung to his clothes. Terry's cause of death was consistent with a lot of the other victims: strangulation. He knew Luby Jeter. One of the most gut-wrenching truths about this case is how many of these children and families knew each other. Atlanta may be big, but all in all, it's a small town. Someone was attacking not only the black community, but also the community of friends and families in a specific area. It was all a little too close to home. 12-year-old Patrick Baltazar worked hard for a kid who had yet to see 13, selling candy at the Galaxy 3 arcade, scrubbing dishes at Fisherman's Cove and Papa's Country Buffet, cleaning tables, even hawking newspapers and cotton candy just to scrape together a few bucks. He had a quiet resilience about him, the kind you only find in kids who've had to grow up too fast. He knew how to hustle and he knew how to survive, or at least he tried to. One day, Patrick and another boy were caught breaking apart some stolen furniture when a strange man began to chase them, almost as if he were hunting them, something that should never happen to anyone, let alone a child. Patrick, smart as a whip, got to a phone and immediately called for help. He told the person on the other end that a man was trying to get to him to harm him, but no one responded, no one came. It makes you wonder if Patrick had called a family member, a random number, or even the police. Either way, they failed him immensely. Even though no one would come to Patrick and his friend's rescue, they would make it out of the situation okay, despite being shaken up. February 6th, 1981 would be the day that death finally caught up to Patrick. He had stopped by Fisherman's Cove to get a few dollars from his dad. He said he might catch the Golden Gloves boxing match or play at the Omni arcade downtown. Witnesses say he made it to the Galaxy 3 arcade at the Omni and was seen there until midnight. Then, just like that, he was gone. A week later, on February 13th, a maintenance man stumbled upon Patrick's body in an overgrown patch of brush behind Corporate Square, an office complex tucked between Buford Highway and I-85. His body lay between the building and a nearby apartment complex. That same morning, a dental assistant named Patsy has seen a light green late 1960s Chevy Impala parked alone in the lot. A white man sat behind the wheel, late 20s, shoulder-length brown hair, then mustache, wearing a plaid flannel shirt. He stared at her in that unforgettable, uncomfortable way that bores into your mind until she disappeared into the office building. Patrick's body sadly showed clear signs of abuse, scrapes, bruises, and once more again, dog hairs scattered across his clothes. He had his life taken from him with someone's bare hands. Manual strangulation. 13-year-old Curtis Walker was trying to make a quick buck by picking up trash with his younger brother at Byron's gun shop on Bankhead Highway. They'd done it before, just another way to help out where they could. After they finished their job on February 19th, 1981, Curtis went looking for more work nearby. He headed off toward a shopping center near Hightower Road, and that was the last time he was ever seen, although someone later claimed to have seen a boy fitting his description getting into a yellow car. For more than 2 weeks, his family waited in agony. Like a lot of other children, he had seemingly vanished into thin air, taken from somewhere that should have been safe. But cases like this always raise the question, is anywhere really safe? Then, on March 6, 1981, a tragic discovery was made. Curtis's body was found in the South River, snagged on a log, a horrendous sight. All of Curtis's clothing had been removed except his underwear, leaving him vulnerable. Fingerprints had also been found on his body from the hands of another, but whether these were tested for a match is unknown. Whoever it was, though, was likely the same attacker as the other cases. Curtis had been strangled. The area where Curtis was found was a quiet wooded area less than a mile from Chapel Hill Harvester Church. The church had recently received multiple taunting phone calls from a man who claimed to be the killer, but seemingly nothing had been done to trace the calls or put a stop to them. Someone was taunting the community and giving hints to where bodies could be found, almost as though he wanted to be caught. However, there would still be quite some time before he was caught, due to the lack of urgency the police department held. Coincidentally or not, witnesses in the area remembered seeing an old green Chevy parked near the riverbank earlier that week, possibly Tuesday or Wednesday. Throughout each of the accounts of the victims and their witnesses, there's a multitude of different cars being spotted, but the green Chevy keeps rearing its ugly hood. Joseph, or Jojo Eugene Bell, was 15 years old, loved music, radio, and the pulse of the community center where he partied with friends. He even attended a radio class at West Georgia College, carving a path towards something more. He had dreams bigger than the neighborhood he grew up in. Dreams that stretched beyond the basketball court at Agnes Jones School or the kitchen at Captain Peg Seafood, where he worked hard for his paycheck. But on March 2nd, 1981, Jojo wouldn't show up for his next shift or be able to hug his mother goodbye. Joseph was last seen playing basketball with a friend. That same friend would later say Joseph got into a station wagon driven by a man on Westview Drive. There's some speculation about who the man may be, someone a lot of people in the community had their eyes on for quite some time, but others weren't so sure. Then, a confusing twist emerged. There was reportedly another young man in the area who also went by Jojo Bell. The details blurred as time passed. People struggled to know who was being spoken of or seen. The day after he vanished, Captain Peggs got a chilling phone call from Joseph. He was distraught, claiming he was almost dead. Then silence. A week later, on March 7th, his mother, still aching from her troubled past and her son being nowhere to be found, received a call from a woman claiming she had him. She didn't know if it was a cruel prank or a cry for help. Either way, it's a surefire way to rip a mother's heart out. Joseph had been living with his grandmother while his mother, Doris Bell, served time for killing his father. Despite the trauma and the absence of his mother, Jojo had carved out a life for himself, staying above water, school, work, friendships, and basketball. He had places he liked to go, people he cared about. He had plans and a bright future ahead of him. But a month and a half later, on April 19th, 1981, two bikers cutting a trail through a wooded area off in Rockdale County stumbled upon something no one should ever have to see. 2 miles from the nearest road, they found Joseph's body. He had been stripped of everything but his underwear, alleging to have been assaulted. Once again, he had been strangled, joining the other children who were victims of this dark time in heaven. He was only 13 years old, a young kid with a big heart and a love for animals. Timothy Hill often made pocket change walking neighborhood dogs on March 11th, 1981. He was playing in his backyard with his niece when something strange happened. She told investigators a man approached him and smeared something that looked like mud on his face, and Timothy left with the man shortly after. That evening, a witness named Frankie Milling said Timothy ended up at a house on Gray Street, a place known to be owned by a pedophile and where lewd and explicit acts of violence occurred, owned by Thomas Uncle Tom Terrell. Milling claimed he, Timothy, and another boy were exploited there. The house was a haven for predatory adults, and a neighbor later reported Terrell kept a bucket of strange mud-like drugs that people inhaled to get high, whether it was really mud with something sinister in it or something far worse. By Thursday night, still at the home on Gray Street, Timothy had allegedly missed the bus and asked if he could stay the night. That Friday, he was seen chatting with a teenage girl. 2 days later, a stranger claimed to have seen him at a rally for the missing and murdered children at Morehouse College, wearing a red baseball cap, perhaps trying to go unnoticed. Then, on Monday, March 16th, his teacher, Teresa Swindle, received 2 heartbreaking phone calls from Timothy. He was sobbing. The calls were traced to northern DeKalb County, but nothing ever came of them. And the next few days, a disturbing pattern emerged. A 15-year-old boy told investigators that Timothy had been promised $50 to wash a woman's dog. He also said someone warned him that Timothy and other children would be found dead in the Chattahoochee River. One peer alleged that a man named Larry Marshall had manipulated both Timothy and the aforementioned Yusuf Bell to go to the Gray Street house, where Marshall and allegedly others would abuse them. In another instance, Timothy had once come running out of a Salvation Army. He was extremely distraught, crying and yelling that he had been anally raped by an adult. Timothy was technically missing, but the number of people who had claimed to see him around town raised a lot of questions. But ultimately, he wouldn't come home. On March 30th, 1981, 2 canoeists discovered Timothy's body in the Chattahoochee River. Like so many other victims, he was clothed only in his underwear and had passed due to being strangled. Timothy Hill's final days were filled with fear, manipulation, and cries for help that were tragically unheard. His story, like a lot of the others we've discussed so far, echoes the haunting silence of a city that didn't know how to protect its children. But it wasn't only children. So far, we've only covered teenagers, but the killer took the lives of many young adults as well. Our murderer is pure evil. Eddie Lamar Duncan Jr. was 21 years old. He was known for being helpful, friendly, and trying to get his life back on track. He had recently been released from a 1-year jail sentence for the possession of stolen goods. He was really trying. He worked odd jobs at a local barbershop, at Courtney's Games and Things, and was also a good friend to Patrick Rogers. On Friday, March 20th, 1981, Eddie boarded a MARTA bus at 2 p.m. to drop off some dry cleaning. Strangely, the cleaning wasn't logged as received until nearly 6 p.m. The 4-hour gap is odd, but perhaps Eddie had some stops to make along the way. That evening, a friend named Earl Mallory saw Eddie walking near his apartment. Mallory recalled Eddie saying, "I've got $20 and we're going to play some pool when I get back." But he never did get to shoot pool. Earlier that day, Eddie had also told his brother Ricky that he'd been offered $200 to help someone move to South Carolina. Another neighbor heard something similar. This time, the money was to help with painting. It's strange that Eddie had allegedly mentioned different names of income for the $200. Just for clarity, $200 in 1981 is the equivalent of about $705 today. Around 10 p.m., Eddie was reportedly seen getting into a car with a light-skinned man near an intersection right by the Varsity, the iconic Atlanta sock hop. After that, he would never be seen alive again. Eddie's disappearance came just days after the arrest of Larry Marshall, who had been disgustingly linked to Timothy Hill and Yusuf Bell. After that point, all victims were either older teenagers or adults. Eddie was the first on March 31st, 1981. Just 1 day after Timothy Hill's body was discovered, canoeists found Eddie's body floating in the Chattahoochee River, mere feet from where Timothy had been found. Eddie was wearing only his boxers, and for reasons unbeknownst, his cause of death was never able to be determined. Eddie was simply trying to make himself a better man, but his opportunity at a brighter future was taken away by someone who thought they had that right. This turn in the case raised a lot of questions. Larry Marshall was arrested, seemingly bringing some justice, and young children are no longer targeted. The killer has moved on to young adults, which is curious. It makes you wonder, was Larry Marshall behind the killings the whole time, and now someone else is targeting adults? Could it be a copycat killer, or simply someone who wanted Atlanta to think it was Larry the whole time and simply decided to change the pattern? Or perhaps Larry was involved the whole time but simply working with someone else. Something to keep in mind as we discuss the next victims is that a lot of the adult men who were killed were all lighter, smaller framed men. None of them were over 150 pounds and were all 5'5" and under. The killer targeted children, and when that got too hot, he moved towards adults who weren't overpoweringly physically strong, but don't let that fact deter you from the fact that all of these men fought hard to keep the air in their lungs. Larry Rogers, who sometimes went by Little Larry, was 20 years old when he disappeared in late March 1981. He was known to be friendly, athletic, and outgoing. He also had a complicated history with Wayne Williams, the man previously mentioned, who was tasked with passing out flyers when Alfred Evans and Edward Smith went missing, the first known victims. This troubled history would raise a lot of red flags for the community, and law enforcement later in the year. In one documented incident, Larry's younger brother had been struck in the head with a 2x4. Before police could even arrive at the scene, Wayne Williams, having heard the call over his police scanner, which is and was illegal for a citizen to possess, beat the authorities there and took Larry Rogers' little brother to the hospital himself. In another strange event, Williams reportedly hid Larry and his brother in an apartment for a little while before reuniting them with their mother. It's no wonder Larry had a distaste for Wayne Williams, and had all of this been looked into earlier, perhaps a lot of deaths could have been prevented. On Monday, March 30th, 1981, Larry was last seen at an Atlanta intersection. A witness named Nellie Trammell claimed she saw Larry getting into a faded green Chevy station wagon with a light-skinned man, whom she identified as Wayne Williams. Trammell said she recognized him from the True Light Baptist Church, though her credibility was questioned when the church's pastor denied ever seeing her in the congregation. 10 days later, on April 9th, 1981, Larry's body was discovered by police in the kitchen of a ground-floor unit at 460 Temple Street, part of a row of abandoned buildings. Outside the apartment, a stolen green Buick Skylark, stripped of its tires, was found ominously parked. Larry's body was clothed in only white swim trunks beneath blue shorts, and a blue shirt had been shoved into his shorts. Dog hairs were also recovered from the body once again, and like many of the children, Larry had been strangled. Larry Rogers' case stands out for multiple reasons. The direct ties to Wayne Williams before his disappearance, the contested eyewitness identification, and the fact that his body was not dumped in the woods or river like many others, but left in an abandoned building. It was both a message and a mystery, buried in the heart of a city already full of them. At this point, you're probably screaming at your phone, computer, TV, or whatever you're watching this on that it has to be Wayne Williams, and spoiler, it likely is. But there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding this case, and Larry Rogers was the only victim to have this close of a tie to Williams. There's no negating his involvement in illicit activities, but it's unfathomable to think that one man could harm this many people at such a fast pace and undetected, and he maintains his innocence. But don't worry, we'll circle back. There's still quite a few young men who wouldn't have a happy ending. Michael McIntosh was 23 years old when he disappeared in early 1981, making him one of the eldest victims in the Atlanta child murders case. He had a troubled past, but despite being dealt a hard hand, he made the best of it. He was well known and liked in his community, and often worked odd jobs at local spots like Captain Peg's, where JoJo Bell worked, which sat just across the street from his house. McIntosh had a lengthy criminal record, including convictions for burglary, theft, possession of marijuana, and attempted rape. He had spent time in several correctional facilities, including the Clark County Correctional Institution and Reedsville Prison. Despite that, those who knew him described him as a familiar and friendly face in the community, sometimes down on his luck but trying to stay afloat with work from temp agencies and boxing matches, including one where he boxed alongside his co-worker and friend JoJo. Michael was last officially reported seen on March 24th, 1981, when he left one of his jobs at the Milton Avenue Foundry. However, friends and family claim to have seen him as late as April 1st, the next day. The next day, on March 25th, a man who owned an import shop said McIntosh came into his store crying and looked like he had been badly beaten up. The shop owner gave McIntosh $12 and directed him towards the nearest MARTA station, helping him get out of whatever situation he was in. The shop owner said he last saw McIntosh heading in the direction of the Chattahoochee River, where his corpse would be found a month later. April 20th, 1981, Michael's body was found on the riverbank by a farmer named Jimmy Brown, whose family owned a nearby fish farm. The discovery site was just downriver from where the bodies of other victims, like Timothy Hill and Eddie Duncan, had been found. Michael's body was completely naked. He was the first victim to be found without any clothing. A lot of the children had been found in minimal clothing or half-clothed, but for a likely heinous reason, Michael was completely undressed. He was in a vulnerable state, not given the kindness of clothing, and he had been brutally strangled at the hands of someone revolting. Atlanta was rapidly becoming more and more panicked. Families were getting angrier. Police were finally beginning to lock in, but 3 more would die before anyone was put behind bars. Jimmy Payne, barely 21, was a young man trying to find his footing and make his way in a big city that was eating people and spitting them out. He had spent time in Alto Correctional Institution in December 1980, after serving time for burglary. Payne had a troubled history of mental health struggles and had attempted to take his own life at least twice. Because of his self-harming affliction, he was under the constant medical care of Dr. Roseman. Those who were close to him spoke highly of him. He was working hard to rebuild his life and better himself. Unfortunately, he wouldn't get the chance to better himself. He was last seen trying to sell 1951 nickels at the Omni, where Patrick Baltazar frequented, on April 21st, 1981. He had plans to go meet a girl he was sweet on, Catherine Turner, later that afternoon at the Vine City MARTA station, but never showed. Given Jimmy's past, people weren't immediately concerned when he didn't hold true to his plans. Rumors spread that he might be trying to disappear and assume a new identity, especially after Fred Wyatt dined at Captain Pegg's and produced Payne's prison ID shortly after he vanished. One 18-year-old named Jerome Young, later arrested for robbing a coin shop, said he saw Payne at a different shop on East Ponce de Leon. Another caller reported seeing him at a club on Peter Street. Jimmy had vanished, but most thought he was simply trying to outrun his past and start over, but that wasn't the case, and it's not confirmed that any of these sightings were actually him. Jimmy was also a known friend of Patman Rogers, connecting so many of the victims to one another. It makes you wonder, were they targeted, or was it simply the result of living in a focused community? 6 days later, on April 27, 1981, his body was discovered in the Chattahoochee River by a couple out fishing on canoes. His body was found on the east bank near Riverview Road, an area disturbingly consistent with where many of the other victims were recovered. Payne was missing all of his clothing except for a red pair of shorts, and a slip of paper in his pocket bore a phone number that led police to Kimberly Road, the residence of Edward Hope Smith, one of the very first victims. William Barrett, known to friends and family as Billy Starr, was a 17-year-old with a rough past and a growing list of unanswered questions surrounding his death. Despite a criminal record that included aggravated assault, drug offenses, and theft, those who knew Barrett said he was trying to find some stability in his life. On the day he disappeared, May 11th, 1981, he had gone to the McDaniel Glen Housing Community Center to pay for a bill for his mother. That same center was also frequented by Patrick Rogers, better known as Patman, who danced there. Later that same day, a neighbor reported seeing Barrett getting into a white two-door car with a black man who had been carrying a purse. This unusual sighting occurred just a few blocks from Barrett's home. An elementary school student would later report a chilling encounter. Someone had approached him offering $3,000 to kill William Barrett. It's utterly baffling that someone would try to hire a hit on such a bright young man, but to approach someone who had yet to reach double digits was not only concerning but disturbing. While that lead ended up being null, it deepened suspicions that Barrett may have been one of the few who were specifically targeted and not seized as a result of opportunity. Barrett was known to hang around a local store with another victim, Luby Jeter. On May 12th, just one day after he was last seen, Barrett's body was found by FBI agents near a wooded curb along near I-20. He was fully clothed except for his missing faded blue jeans, which were strewn nearby. He had died of asphyxiation, like so many others, and his body showed signs of a post-mortem stab wound and was covered in white animal hairs, likely dog hairs, but undisclosed. A phone number was found in Barrett's jean pocket, and it traced back to a predatory white man who had allegedly been seen trying to pick up boys at the 5 Points MARTA station and at the Omni. Multiple witnesses said that they had seen both William Barrett and Luby Jeter at this house of this white man, being manipulated into Lord knows what. Interestingly, Harold Wood, a 32-year-old high school custodian who ran out of gas about a mile from the scene, was waiting for relief on the side of the road. He told authorities he had seen a suspicious-looking black man with a Cadillac standing at the exact location where the body was later found. Wood had taken note of the man and thought he seemed strange because he stared at him hard before driving away. The man was never identified, but could have been a possible suspect or perhaps just another ghost of Atlanta. By late May 1981, Atlanta was exhausted, and the killings had been happening for nearly 2 years. The body count climbed, the suspect list remained blurry, and public trust in the investigation was fraying. There was just too much uncertainty. And then, a 27-year-old man known to frequent downtown nightlife vanished. Cater, the oldest victim yet, would sacrifice his life to save the lives of many others. Cater was last spotted on the night of May 21st, 1981, outside the Rialto Theater at around 9:30 p.m. A witness reported seeing Cater holding hands with, you guessed it, Wayne Williams. Earlier that same day, Cater had been seen near the Greyhound bus station and the Cameo Lodge, a known haunt for those soliciting sex and drugs, where he was a familiar face. It's insinuated but not confirmed that he may have been a sex worker and hung around the Cameo Lounge during his free time. Hotel clerk Lyle Nichols also recalled seeing Cater around 3 p.m. at the Falcon Hotel, where Cater resided. Yet despite these consistent sightings on May 21st, at least 3 individuals claimed to have seen him alive on May 23rd, including his quote, running buddy, a Cameo Lounge regular, and another witness who said Cater entered the Healy building that same day. On May 24th, just days after his last verified sighting, Cater's body was found naked on the banks of the Chattahoochee River by two boys who had gone fishing. Alongside his body were unusual items: a safe with undisclosed contents, some clothing, and scarily, a submachine gun. The cause of death was ruled yet again as asphyxiation. Nathaniel Cater's murder would become the final death officially linked to Wayne Williams in court. It was the last body found before the arrest, and though many questions still surround the case, including doubts about timing, witnesses' reliability, and the significance of the items found near Cater, his death marked the end of the official Atlanta child murders timeline. Nathaniel Cater would be the reason that Wayne Williams was caught. Due to the number of bodies that had been recovered in the Chattahoochee River, investigators decided their best course of action would be to stake out the James Jackson Parkway bridge that ran over the river and wait for another body to be disposed of. This likely wouldn't have flown nowadays. Waiting for someone else to die to catch the killer seemed cruel, and honestly, a tad lazy given how long these killings went on. In the early hours of May 22nd, 1981, the day Nathaniel Cater vanished, as police were on a stakeout, they were alarmed by hearing a large unnatural splash. Detectives claimed it sounded like a body hitting the water. They perked up to the sound and then immediately saw the headlights of a car, a 70s Chevy, driving slowly over the bridge. Police rushed to the vehicle and apprehended the driver. Behind the wheel was one Wayne Williams. No one would have guessed that Williams would commit such horrid acts. He was a music promoter, a photographer, and a self-employed talent scout. He seemed to have a lot going for him, but perhaps success wasn't enough. He itched for violence, but he'd finally been stopped, identified, and eventually stowed behind iron bars. The explanation Williams gives to police for driving slowly over the bridge in the middle of the night in a heavily wooded area was that he was scouting talent for a female artist he was allegedly representing, which just sounds extremely silly. And police thought so too. I mean, what was he really out there doing? Once Nathaniel Cater was found, police knew exactly what he was up to that night. They were convinced Wayne Williams was the killer. There was finally some hope in the community that the killings would cease, but those 24 children and young adults couldn't be brought back to life, and so a gaping hole was still left in the hearts of Atlantans. Because of the lack of evidence surrounding Wayne Williams, he couldn't be immediately arrested, but police watched him like a hawk in the following weeks. They followed him, did a background check, ran his plates, searched his home, and collected DNA and forensic evidence. They were doing everything they could to bring the murders to an end. Finally, the most damning evidence against Williams were fibers found in his home. They took fibers from his carpet and bedspread, and they matched fibers found on victims Jimmy Payne and Nathaniel Cater. And remember all the victims who were found with white dog hair on them? They all came back as a match for Williams' dog, Sheba. Williams also couldn't seem to keep his story straight, contradicting himself constantly regarding his whereabouts. Many witnesses also placed Williams with or near victims in the last locations they were seen, and he failed a polygraph test with flying colors. Even though so many people had lost their lives, there still wasn't a ton of reliable evidence for all the victims. Ultimately, Williams was only convicted of the murders of Jimmy Payne and Nathaniel Cater, leaving so many victims and their families without closure. Throughout the entire trial, Williams was adamant that he was in no way involved with any of the murders, but the prosecution thought differently, and so did the jury. Williams actually claimed during the trial that he had been framed and that the fiber evidence was null. Why he said this is beyond reason. DNA doesn't lie. The defense also argued that Williams was targeted as the perpetrator because he was a black man, and they believe the police failed to investigate all avenues thoroughly, including white supremacist groups and local pedophile rings. The trial lasted for a long 10 weeks, but the jury only deliberated for 12 hours before finding Williams guilty on counts of the murder of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne. To this very day, Williams maintains his innocence, claiming he had no part in the Atlanta child murders. The case was officially closed, but a lot of people were doubtful that he committed all those crimes by himself. However, it must be taken into account that this string of murders ceased the moment he was arrested. While travesty is prevalent in our world today, and children and adults still have crimes committed against them, arresting Wayne Williams was a step in the right direction, putting at least one evil man behind bars. The killings officially stopped in 1981, but the pain never did. The community never stopped carrying the weight of those years. For many of them, justice never came, closure never followed, and the full truth never emerged. What they were left with were questions that echoed louder with time. Why did it take so long for the city to act? Why were these children, their children, treated as if they were invisible? Atlanta tried to move on. The city rebranded itself as a rising economic powerhouse, eager to put the trauma behind it. But in the neighborhoods where these boys and young men lived and died, the scars remained. There are some who believe the case was solved, that Wayne Williams was responsible, that the killings ended because he was taken off the streets. But others aren't so sure. The evidence wasn't always clear, the investigations were rushed, and the narratives often shifted depending on who was speaking. Too many loose ends, too many names left off the official list, too many grieving families still unsure what to believe. What's undeniable is that at least 29 lives were taken from them. They were sons, daughters, and students, brothers and friends. They were dreamers and dancers and boxers and artists. They lived in a city that failed to protect them, and yet in telling their stories now, we resist letting them be forgotten. Whoever was behind the Atlanta child murders took more than lives. They took a sense of safety, a sense of trust. But even now, in the silence that followed, there are still voices that refuse to go quiet, families who still want answers, communities who still demand the truth, and a city that still owes them both. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.